All right, strap in, everyone, because today we are going deep on ego death.
Whoa, that sounds intense.
It does have a kind of a dramatic, like sci-fi ring to it, right?
Yeah, but at its core, we're really just looking at this idea of a temporary loss of self-identity.
And that seems to be a pretty common thread in reports of psychedelic experiences, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
This feeling that you were dissolving, that the boundaries between you and the world outside are kind of blurring.
Exactly.
And we've got some super fascinating research today that's going to help us get a handle on what is actually happening in the brain during these experiences.
Right.
I mean, we're talking psychedelics, right?
Right.
Psilocybin, LSD, DMT.
Yeah.
These substances seem to have the power to really shake up our whole sense of self, at least temporarily.
Yeah, that's right. And what's really interesting is the connection between psychedelics and this network in the brain called the default mode network.
Or the DMN.
It's a DMN, exactly.
Okay, so remind me here, what is the DMN again?
So the default mode network is a network of brain regions that is active when we're not focused on a task.
Ah, okay.
So it's involved in, things like daydreaming, self-reflection, thinking about the past or the future.
Okay, so that means like when my mind is wandering.
Exactly.
Like when I'm just kind of lost in thought.
Yeah, so when you're replaying that awkward conversation you had this morning or planning your next vacation, that's the DMN.
Okay, got it. So it's like the me network.
In a way, yeah, it's very involved in constructing our sense of self, our sense of I, that feeling of separateness from the world around us.
So is that why people on psychedelics feel like they're losing their sense of self then? Because that network is being affected.
Well, that's the main theory, and it makes sense when you think about it.
Because if that part of the brain is usually so active, and then suddenly it's not,
Exactly.
then yeah, those boundaries might start to blur.
Right.
People start feeling like they're like melting into their surroundings.
Yeah, they report feeling a sense of oneness, a sense of unity with everything around them.
Okay, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm starting to get it, but I also just say I'm a little skeptical.
Sure.
I mean, is it really that simple?
Yeah.
Decreased DMN activity equals ego death?
Well, it's obviously more nuanced than just the DMN shutting down completely.
Right.
There are other brain networks involved, and there's a lot of interaction happening between different brain areas, but quieting the DMN does seem to be a key factor in this ego dissolution thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's more like the DMN is, I don't know, like the conductor of an orchestra.
Yeah, I like that.
And when the conductor takes a break, suddenly all the different sections of the orchestra are free to improvise.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
And they play off each other in new and maybe unexpected ways.
That's a great way to think about it.
Okay, that's a cool way to visualize it. But where does this idea of entropy fit into all of this? You mentioned that before.
Right, so entropy is another really important concept that comes up a lot in this research.
Okay, entropy. Now, isn't that like about disorder and chaos?
Yeah, like your desk after a particularly busy week.
Exactly, like my life, pretty much.
Right, well, in the context of the brain, entropy refers to the level of randomness and unpredictability in neural activity.
Okay.
And here's the thing, psychedelics seem to increase entropy in the brain.
Wait, hold on. How can more disorder in the brain be a good thing?
Right, it sounds counterintuitive, but it turns out that sometimes a little bit of chaos can actually be beneficial.
Really?
Yeah, think about it. Our brains tend to get stuck in these rigid thought patterns, habits and ways of seeing the world.
Yeah, I know all about that.
And while those patterns can be useful, they can also trap us in like negative loops of anxiety or, depression or even addiction.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
So the idea is that psychedelics can come in and shake things up a bit.
Introduce a little randomness.
Exactly. And by increasing entropy, they create a state of greater flexibility and openness in the brain.
Okay, interesting. So it's like shaking up a snow globe.
Yeah, exactly.
It might look messy at first, but then it allows for these like new patterns to emerge.
Exactly. So it's not just about quieting the DMN, it's also about creating more chaos and randomness in the brain.
That is wild.
It is, but it's important to remember that this chaos is not necessarily destructive.
Okay.
It can actually be quite the opposite.
Okay.
It can lead to new insights, creative breakthroughs, and even like a profound shift in perspective.
Wow. Okay, my mind is officially blown.
Good. That's the goal.
So psychedelics increase entropy, shake up the DMN, and that somehow leads to this profound experience of ego dissolution.
Yeah.
I think I'm starting to see the bigger picture here, but I still have so many questions.
Of course.
Like, for instance, what does all of this look like on a neurological level? Like, what's going on in the brain?
Right, well, there's still a lot we don't know, but research is starting to uncover some pretty fascinating details about how psychedelics are actually rewiring the brain, at least temporarily.
Rewiring the brain. Okay, now you've got my attention.
Good.
I think that's a great place to pick up after a break.
Sounds good.
So we'll be back in a moment to dig into those details.
All right.
Stay with us.
We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back.
Okay, so before the break, we were talking about how psychedelics can actually rewire the brain,
Right.
creating those new connections and increasing entropy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot to wrap my head around.
Yeah, it is.
But you mentioned real-life examples, and I am curious to hear how all this theoretical stuff actually translates into people's experiences. So you brought some research on psilocybin, right?
Yeah, I did.
It seems like that's the psychedelic that's getting the most attention these days in the research.
Yeah, for sure.
So what are we learning about psilocybin and how it affects people?
So one of the areas where psilocybin is showing a lot of promise is in the treatment of mental health conditions like anxiety and depression.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I've read about studies with cancer patients
Right.
where they were given psilocybin to help them cope with fear and anxiety.
Exactly.
And the results seem pretty incredible.
Yeah, they are really impressive.
So, but these weren't just casual experiments.
Right. No, absolutely not.
This was done in a very structured way.
Yeah, the psilocybin sessions were very structured. They had trained therapists there to guide the participants through their experiences.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Even if the drug is creating this kind of mental flexibility, that decrease in activity in the DMN,
Right.
you probably still need some help processing, such an intense experience.
Yeah, absolutely. The therapists play a crucial role in helping participants make sense of what they're experiencing.
Oh, interesting.
Help connect the dots between the experience and their own personal struggles and, help them find meaning in what might otherwise feel overwhelming or even frightening.
Wow. Yeah, so it's like having a guide, right?
Yeah,
Through uncharted territory
exactly.
to help you navigate, this kind of new terrain.
That's a great way to put it.
So, and what's amazing is that even years later, the people who had this psilocybin-assisted therapy reported feeling more connected to life, more at peace with themselves and with the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's really something.
It is.
It sounds like the experience really shifted their perspective in a lasting way.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that researchers have been able to use brain imaging techniques to study the effects of psilocybin in real time.
No way.
And it's here where the idea of the default mode network really comes into play.
Okay.
So brain scans actually show a clear reduction in activity in the DMN during the psilocybin experience.
Really? So that DMN, that part of the brain that's usually active when we're, self-reflecting and thinking about ourselves,
Right.
it gets quiet during these psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, precisely. And researchers believe that this temporary deactivation of the DMN is a key factor in the sense of ego dissolution that people report.
But why would quieting the DMN have such a big impact?
Right.
Is it just about, reducing self-awareness?
Well, it's not just about reducing self-awareness. The DMN is also thought to be really involved in those rigid thought patterns we were talking about earlier. The negative self-talk, those anxiety loops, constantly replaying past events.
Yeah, all that stuff.
Right, so when the DMN quiets down, those mental ruts might loosen their grip, allowing for new perspectives and new ways of thinking.
So that's how those new connections, that, rewiring can happen.
That's the idea.
I mean, it's like a two-pronged approach,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
You've got the quieting of the DMN on one hand, this kind of letting go of the ego and all the usual mental chatter. And then on the other hand, you've got this surge of communication between parts of the brain that don't normally talk to each other.
Exactly, and it's this crosstalk that is thought to be behind some of those more mystical or transcendent aspects of the experience.
Oh, really? Like what?
The feeling of unity with the universe, the sense of awe and wonder, those insights into the nature of reality that people talk about.
That is incredible.
Yeah, it really is.
Okay, so it is kind of like shaking up that snow globe, right? You're disrupting those usual patterns and allowing something totally new and unexpected to kind of take shape.
Yeah, and even though this new configuration is temporary,
Right.
it can have a profound impact on how we see ourselves in the world.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, you know?
It's like our brains are capable of so much more than we normally realize.
Yeah, absolutely.
And these psychedelics are kind of giving us a glimpse into that potential. But let's be real here for a second. Not everyone who takes psychedelics has a positive experience.
Right, yeah.
I mean, we've all heard stories about bad trips, those scary moments. And, some people even talk about long-term negative consequences.
Yeah, for sure. And it's important to acknowledge that psychedelic experiences can be challenging, even frightening sometimes.
Yeah.
And while the research suggests that serious adverse effects are rare,
Okay.
especially in a controlled setting, they're not impossible.
Yeah, that's why I think this idea of just legalizing everything is
Right.
a little worrisome.
Yeah, for sure. I think uncontrolled use, without that proper preparation and guidance and integration
Yeah,
can be risky.
right. That's why I think all this research is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
We need to learn as much as we can about how to use these substances safely and effectively.
For sure.
To really understand both the potential risks and the potential benefits.
Absolutely.
Okay, so where do we go from here then? I mean, if these substances have all this incredible potential, but they also have these risks,
Yeah.
how do we move forward in a responsible way?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's, a question that researchers and therapists and policymakers are all wrestling with right now.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a growing movement to reschedule psilocybin and other psychedelics to make them more accessible for research and for therapeutic use.
Okay.
But it has to be done carefully.
Yeah, it seems like it's really about striking a balance, right?
Yeah.
Acknowledging the potential benefits, but also recognizing the risks involved.
Exactly.
It's not a simple issue.
It's not, and it's a conversation that we're really just starting to have.
Right.
But it's an important one, if we can figure out how to harness the power of these substances safely and responsibly.
Yeah.
It could really revolutionize how we think about mental health and consciousness and even the nature of reality itself.
That's a big if.
It is a big if,
Right.
yet it's exciting, right?
Yeah.
It is. It's incredibly exciting to think about the possibilities.
Yeah, well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from this science of the brain to the potential therapeutic benefits of psychedelics.
Yeah.
But now I want to shift gears a bit
Okay.
and explore some of the more philosophical questions that all of this raises.
Okay.
So if psychedelics can temporarily dissolve our sense of self, what does that tell us about the nature of consciousness itself?
Right.
That's a question that philosophers have been debating for centuries.
It has.
And now science is, finally starting to kind of weigh in.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area, and it's, ripe for exploration.
It is. It's fascinating.
Yeah, this research is really challenging our fundamental assumptions about who we are and how we experience the world.
Right.
And it's opening up some really profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the self, and even the fabric of reality.
Okay, well, I am intrigued, so let's dive into those deeper waters then. All right, so we've gone pretty deep into the brain on psychedelics.
Yeah, we have.
Talked about the DMN quieting down, entropy going up, even the brain rewiring itself. But now I want to get kind of philosophical.
Okay.
If these substances can temporarily dissolve our sense of self,
Right.
what does that tell us about consciousness itself?
That's the big question, isn't it?
I mean, our sense of self usually feels so solid, so real.
Yeah, it does.
But then you hear about people having these experiences where that self just seems to evaporate.
Right, and they come back and they report these feelings of being connected to everything.
Yeah.
Like they're a part of some larger universal consciousness.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
It is.
So is our ego just a construct then? It's like a temporary state that we can step out of under the right conditions?
Well, that's a question philosophers have been debating for centuries.
Yeah, for sure.
And now psychedelic research is providing some new and interesting insights.
Yeah, because if we can temporarily dissolve the ego,
Right.
it suggests that maybe it's not as fixed and permanent as we think it is.
Yeah, I think a lot of this research points to the possibility that our sense of self is more fluid,
Okay.
more malleable than we typically think. And that maybe there are other states of consciousness available to us, beyond our typical ego-centered mode of being.
It's almost like we're conditioned to see the world through this narrow lens of the self.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And then psychedelics come along and they crack that lens open.
Right, offering us a glimpse of what's beyond those usual boundaries.
And that glimpse can be incredibly liberating for people.
It can.
Freeing us from the anxieties and the fears that that often come with having like a limited sense of self.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I was reading about one of the cancer patients in the psilocybin study.
Yeah.
And she said something that really stuck with me.
Oh.
She said, it was like my fear just melted away. I realized that death was just a part of life, and that there was nothing to be afraid of.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is, and so many people report like a decreased fear of death after these experiences.
Right, yeah.
It's like they've touched this reality where death isn't the end.
Yeah.
It's just a transition.
Yeah.
And that realization can be incredibly empowering. You know?
Absolutely.
It allows people to kind of live more fully in the present moment.
Yeah, to focus more on the here and now.
Without being consumed by fear and anxiety.
Exactly.
Okay, so even if we can like wrap our heads around this idea that, you know, our sense of self is more fluid than we usually think,
Yeah.
that still doesn't really explain those reports of feeling connected to like a larger universal consciousness.
Right. That's where things get a little more mysterious.
Yeah, because that starts to sound a lot like spirituality.
Yeah.
Which isn't exactly, you know, a very scientific topic.
It's definitely tricky territory, but what's interesting is that, you know, even a lot of the researchers who are involved in this work,
Okay.
they're starting to acknowledge that there might be something to these experiences.
Yeah.
They can't just be dismissed as hallucinations or, you know, wishful thinking.
Yeah, I mean, the reports are so consistent
Yeah.
across cultures and historical periods. You know, people who've never even heard of psychedelics are describing very similar experiences
Yeah.
of unity and transcendence and this connection to something much bigger than themselves.
Yeah, and that universality is really hard to ignore.
It is.
It suggests that maybe there is something more to consciousness than, you know, just the physical workings of the brain.
Right, like maybe there's some underlying interconnectedness to all things.
Yeah, and psychedelic research is really forcing us to consider that possibility.
It's almost like science is finally catching up to like ancient wisdom traditions,
In a way, yeah.
you know, that have been saying these things for millennia.
Yeah, that's both exciting and challenging.
It is.
It requires us to really expand our understanding of what's possible.
Yep.
To be open to new ways of seeing the world and our place in it.
So where do we go from here?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? The research is ongoing.
Yeah.
And we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what psychedelics can teach us
Right.
about consciousness, the brain, and really the nature of reality itself.
It's a journey that requires a lot of curiosity
Yeah, for sure.
and openness
And humility.
and a willingness to really question our assumptions.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to have to wrap things up here.
Sounds good.
But as we continue to explore this uncharted territory, we may very well discover that the most profound truths are often found in the most unexpected places.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into ego death.
It was a pleasure.
We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe even a new perspective on the mysteries of the mind.
The exploration continues.